no longer will I question why the Volcano Island honey is so expensive in the stores. Because that's the wrong word to describe it. It really is. It's the right price for the right product. And maybe if I can add a little bit to the message today, you'll have an even more valuable product. Because that's been my passion as a physician for the last 5 years, is try to disseminate this message. Honey is not a sweetener. Honey is a wonderful food, and I'm actually going to start at the end of my presentation and work back today, because I want to tell you 3 things that honey is from a physiologic, medical point of view. Honey basically, number 1, regulates blood sugar. And people will hear that and say, well, that's really weird. How can taking a sugar regulate blood sugar? And the answer is really quite simple. The 2 sugars, Richard referred to them as dextrose and levulose. I refer to them as glucose and fructose, one being glucose or dextrose, and fructose, which is fruit sugar. Those 2 sugars are in the ideal ratio in honey to regulate and control blood sugar levels in the human. There's no other food that can do that except for honey. I have looked at all kinds of foods and studied their ratios and their combinations of sugars, and there are none. That's why I call honey God's gold standard food. It really is the gold standard from which we can compare all other foods to in terms of its regulatory effect on blood sugar.
What's the ratio?
About, well, it depends on the varietal, but about 38 to 30. Some say about 40 to 32. It's really about 1 to 1. The important thing is that the dextrose, levulose, or glucose-fructose ratio is about 1 to 1 in most honey varietals. Interestingly enough, in Hawaii you have another challenge, and that is sometimes the bees will forage on nectars that have a higher sucrose content, and whereas the glucose content is not quite as high, they'll bring more sucrose back and you'll have a higher sucrose content in the honeys here. Some countries actually don't like, and they'll actually test for it, and when the sucrose content is too high, they won't allow you to even import it. I think that's been your experience.
Yeah, we can't get in, we have trouble getting into Japan.
Yeah.
But this, maybe you can answer for us, because we haven't figured it out. This honey comes in so fast
Yes.
that it has a high sucrose content. As it ripens, the sucrose content goes down,
Yes.
and so if we send older honey to Japan, it gets in, but newer honey will get barred at the border.
Exactly, and the answer basically is in the timing and in the time that it can stay in the hive or with the bee. And by leaving it in the hive longer, the sucrose content is going to be lower, which you can do when you don't have a honey that's as quality of honey as over here. So mainland honeys, and especially the Midwest, Colorado, they leave it in the hive. They may harvest once a year only. That's it. It's the only crop, and that's your experience, you know. Mm-hmm. So by regulating blood sugar, honey is a gold standard food. Say, how can a sugar regulate a sugar? The answer really is quite simple. Because all cells in the body can metabolize glucose or dextrose. Only one cell in the entire body can metabolize fructose or fruit sugar, and that's liver cells. The way our bodies have been created is that we have a transport mechanism in our gut that transports fructose twice as fast as glucose. So when you eat honey, the fructose component or the levulose component of honey actually gets brought into the blood faster. But since no cells can take it in, they don't have the enzymes or the transport mechanisms to transport it across the cell barrier, except in the liver, it will immediately go into the liver. So fructose arrives in the liver cells first. Then glucose, which has a single transport mechanism, follows, and now you've got glucose in the blood, or blood sugar, as we all are focused on, and if we have diabetes or pre-diabetic. So we've got glucose circulating, but the liver cells are primed and ready to receive the glucose, because the liver cell unlocks an enzyme from its nucleus called glucokinase. Glucokinase is what makes glucose come into the liver cell, where it gets stored as liver glucose, or we call it glycogen, which is simply sugar that gets stored in the liver. And we'll come back to this a little bit later, but the important storage point for glucose is the liver. And if it was not for the fructose-glucose ratio as found in honey, it would not produce the blood regulating, the glucose regulating that happens by ingesting honey. It's an absolute miracle. And no other food can do this except those that have equal ratios of fructose and glucose. What are those foods? Most fruits. and some vegetables. But vegetables, while they'll have an equal ratio of fructose and glucose, the same two sugars as found in honey, vegetables also have an inordinate amount of what we call starch, which is nothing more than excess glucose. When glucose is stored in plants, we call it starch. When glucose is stored in humans, we call it glycogen. Same thing, glycogen is starch. So vegetables have a high component of starch. The human body stores glucose as glycogen. But the only foods that produce stored glycogen in the liver cell are ones that have 1-to-1 ratios. And that's why honey is the ideal food to produce storage of sugar in the liver cell. The second important thing that honey does is honey promotes restorative sleep. I met a gal Saturday at the talk that we gave in Waimea. She's from Honduras, and she said 40, 50 years ago, her mama told her to take honey before bedtime because it helped her sleep. She said, I never knew why. But the reason is really quite simple. Honey has two sugars, glucose and fructose. When you ingest honey, the glucose portion of the honey raises insulin levels slightly. Insulin, as you may know, is what causes the problems that most of us have with diabetes and so on, because we eat too much glucose, we overproduce insulin, our bodies are saturated with excessive productions of insulin, and we get what's called insulin resistance after 10, 20, 30, 40 years. Insulin resistance is what causes all of the diseases related to obesity, diabetes, up to Alzheimer's disease at the other end. Insulin resistance is the problem caused by eating excessive glucose. And insulin really is a fat-storing hormone. When you produce more insulin, it drives all the blood into all the sugar into your cells where it gets stored as fat. When you eat honey, it produces only a very slight rise in insulin. And that slight rise in insulin is just enough to liberate tryptophan into the blood circulation. Tryptophan gets into the brain. Tryptophan in the brain is converted to serotonin, which is the relaxation hormone. And when the lights are off, serotonin is converted into melatonin, which now is basically the hormone of recovery during sleep. So ingesting honey just before bedtime promotes what I call restorative or recovery sleep. That's the second most significant thing. First, it regulates blood sugar. Second, it promotes recovery or restorative sleep. And thirdly, because it produces restorative sleep, in other words, it allows you to sleep throughout the night, it basically reduces what I call metabolic stress. This is nothing more than internal stress. All stress is translated in the body as the function of the adrenal glands. So the adrenal glands, when we're under stress, whether it's emotional stress, environmental stress, or internal physiologic stress, it's all the same to the body. Adrenal glands produce adrenaline. Adrenaline, we know as the hormone of fight or flight. We are energized, we are wide awake, and it also produces cortisol. Cortisol is produced by the adrenal glands primarily to block insulin. So if insulin is inhibited with cortisol, blood sugar stays constant to fuel the brain. Brain starvation or brain hunger is the primary cause of metabolic stress, something that we have not known in medical circles until the last 12 years. It's been only that recent. It'll take another 10 to 20 years before this gets cycled into clinical practice. So I say the third most important thing that honey does is it reduces metabolic stress, because if we take it at night, we now no longer experience metabolic stress, and I'll show you a picture of why we do that later on.
What's the recommended amount to take it for?
Depends on when you ate last and what you ate. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute, but let me describe it for you now. If you eat at 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock, our liver glycogen store, which only contains about 80 grams of glucose or glycogen, may be full at 7 o'clock if we ate some amino acids from proteins, or ate some fruit, or ate some honey. If we did not, our liver glycogen store may not even be full at all. But we burn 10 grams an hour of liver glucose. So if we ate last at 6 o'clock, our liver glycogen store is full at 7, 10 grams an hour we lose. By 2 o'clock in the morning, which is 5 hours later, we now only have 20 or 30 grams of glucose stored in our liver. By 3 o'clock in the morning, we may only have 10, and at that point, a trouble signal goes out from the liver that alerts the brain that says your fuel supply is running low. It's just like the low fuel indicator on your car. When you're about out of gas, you've got 30 miles to go, the light blinks, as yours is doing right now, probably. That happens at 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. The brain now alerts the adrenal glands to stimulate the production of adrenaline and cortisol. What does adrenaline do to you at 3 o'clock in the morning?
Wakes you up.
Cortisol now circulates through the blood because of the adrenal stimulation. Cortisol's function is to go to the muscle proteins, break them down into amino acids, let them enter the bloodstream, send them back to the liver to make new sugar. The process is called gluconeogenesis, the formation of new sugar in the liver from amino acids. So at 3 o'clock in the morning, two things have happened. You're now wide awake because of the adrenaline, and your body is now cannibalizing its own proteins to make sugar so that you can get through the rest of the night. And after about 30 to 40, 50 minutes, your brain says, aha, there is now enough liver stored in the liver, enough sugar stored in the liver to get me through the rest of the night and let you go back to sleep. Hundreds of thousands of millions of people experience this night after night after night after night, and they have no idea. And medicine, in all of its wisdom that I learned when I was in medical school, was this was simply part of our diurnal cycle. In other words, our circadian rhythms were adjusted so that we secreted adrenaline at 3, 4 o'clock in the morning. And now that I know why, I want to just strangle some of my professors. They did not tell us why. They said it was a normal process. It is not normal at all. The process occurs only because we do not have enough fuel in the tank, the liver, to get our brain through 8 hours of sleep. And honey is the gold standard food to get us through. In answer to your question, how much should you take? If your liver storage capacity holds 80 grams, and you go to bed at 11 o'clock, and it's down now to 50 grams, which it probably is, 2 tablespoons of honey will fill up the tank. 1 tablespoon will produce about 30 grams of liver glucose or liver glycogen. 15 grams. 2 tablespoons will produce about 30. So if you're down to about 50 grams, 2 tablespoons will fill it back up to the top. If you diminish your liver storage of glucose at 10 grams an hour, you now have 8 hours of sleep, and you can get through the night. Yes?
How would you know if you have 80 or 50 grams?
You don't know. That's the thing. You really. That's why I enjoy talking to folks, because we have to understand that what creates liver glucose. Medicine in general, I never learned this in school, I never learned it in practice, but we're never taught what creates liver glycogen. You know what we're taught? What creates blood sugar elevation. Our focus in 50 years of clinical practice has been on one thing: blood sugar. How do you control blood sugar? Well, eat less calories, eat less glucose, eat less starch. That's just baloney. I'm serious. I'm absolutely serious in saying that. It is not truth, because you can control your calorie consumption and not affect your liver glucose store one bit. And so we just have to we have a process of re-education that has to take place in this country that changes the way we think of what we eat and how we eat it and when. Because our goal in eating should not be to eat less calories, nor to eat less carbohydrates, nor to eat less starch. It should be, how do we maximize the production of sugar in the liver, which gets our brain through the night. Because when we do that, we prevent metabolic stress, and we increase recovery sleep, which prevents disease for some, lowers the risks of many diseases for others, and improves or restores health for all.
Is it just at night or during daytime too?
Great question. I'm going to come back to the first slide here in a minute. But when you say, is it just during night, what happens if we go to sleep at night? Our liver has 80 grams of glycogen in it. It depletes 10 grams an hour. And we sleep for 8 hours. What happens to our liver glycogen by the time we wake up in the morning?
It's depleted.
Completely gone. Our brain is now triggering this same event of metabolic stress. But what do most of us eat in the morning? First thing, grab a cup of coffee, which does nothing for our liver glycogen store, or grab some pastries and a donut, or worse, eat cereal. I mean, the things that propel our entire culture of eating are the worst things we should possibly eat in the morning. What do we eat in the morning first thing? A tablespoon of honey. Or some fruit. Or something that has vegetables with a limited amount of starch in it. We do just the opposite. Or eat some amino acids, because protein, or eggs, or bacon, or sausage will produce amino acids which over 3 or 4 hours will now restore it. But the goal in every meal or snack should be to eat something that refills our liver tank, which fuels our brain, which prevents metabolic stress. That's the message. That's the entire talk. I could quit now. If you understand those 3 points, that's really the whole thing. I'll show you a couple more slides and then we'll be done and take some questions if you want. What does it take to get from almond blossoms, which is basically very bad tasting honey? You don't want to eat almond honey. Ever had almond blossom honey?
No, I didn't.
It's not good. the bees will survive on it, but it's not good honey. So what the guys who pollinate do is they truck their bees to California, they pollinate for a season, then they take them home, and they've got about 3 months that they don't have to feed their bees, if they had a good pollination pollination season in California. So the honey almond blossom honey is basically reserved for the bees, who use it to get their new brood going and start another cycle of honey production throughout the summer months. I don't know that, I think that looks more like a bumblebee, but to get to this is another one of these absolute miracles, which you have compounded tremendously by the story you've told, Richard, but it takes 55,000 miles flown, 2 million flowers visited, 40 to 80,000 bees in each hive, each producing a maximum of 1/12 of a teaspoon of honey in her lifetime. It's just an absolutely amazing, miraculous feat that little honey can be produced by so many bees that creates so much wonderful, wonderful food.
Tell about that picture.
What about it?
How it's
There's a sleeping bee. Isn't that a wonderful bee picture? He's sleeping on a blade of grass. His bee has finally worn out. He just went to sleep.
And not that sleeping.
And this is another one of my favorites. The pollen collecting abrasive material on their hind legs collects pollen in these balls, and that's a pollen ball right there. I don't know what kind of pollen this is, but a red pollen ball that the bee carries back. They're laden. Now they're filled up with honey or nectar from the flowers, and they've got these pollen balls on them. They can barely limp back to their home, but they make it back. This gets scraped off of their hind legs and deposited and combined with honey and also with royal jelly for the food that's fed to queens and so on. But this is just a miraculous process. It's so fascinating. And I'm sorry I don't have a lot of Hawaiian flowers here, but we'll have some after this trip because I took a lot of pictures. So 300 different varietals of honey in the United States. Buckwheat honey. Buckwheat honey, by the way, is an interesting honey because buckwheat is a darker honey that contains more antioxidants than any other honey varietal that's ever been tested. So it's the one honey that was used in the cough suppressant study at Penn State University, which they fed honey to pediatric patients who had upper respiratory infections, and found that a teaspoon of honey given to a pediatric patient with an upper respiratory infection and a cough at nighttime worked better to suppress the cough and to allow the patients to sleep than did the best over-the-counter cough suppressant dextromethorphan. Dextromethorphan is widely available in non-prescription forms, but honey did better than it did. And it also helped the parents sleep better when the parents did it. So that was a side benefit. I'll just zoom through these. Many Tupelo honey is an interesting honey. Its fructose content is slightly higher. It's also a honey that never crystallizes. You can let it sit on the shelf for months and it will never crystallize, as opposed to honeys here which naturally crystallize because of their glucose content. Fructose honeys will not, higher fructose content honeys will not crystallize. And it's also quite a good honey. I like Colorado wildflower honey because that's basically all we can get in Colorado. Orange blossom honey is also very good honey. People say all the time, I can't take honey, I have diabetes. It's just one of these things that as a physician, I tell them, you know, if you're diabetic, you better be taking honey. Most of the rest of the world, except the United States, uses honey as the first line of defense against diabetes. The United States does not. Doctors consider it another sugar. It needs to be factored into your carbohydrate load or your glucose load. And again, it's just a myth. Honey will regulate blood sugar, as I started out. It's all the same. You hear that say the body can't tell one sugar from the other. This article was written in the Detroit Free Press. Honey, brown sugar, high fructose corn syrup, all no nutrition sugar. It's just nuts. The information that's known about honey, or thought to be known, has over 180 substances in it, and I won't go into those, but these substances, including the bioflavonoids and the minerals and elements, have only within the last 2 years been found to control insulin release from the pancreas. Now, isn't that amazing? The reason that the sugars in honey are different are because honey contains substances like zinc oxide and glutathione and things like that that we have only discovered in medical science in the last 2 years that regulate insulin secretion. Well, isn't that amazing? Of course they're not different. If you take sucrose or high fructose corn syrup or glucose from any other source, it has none of these substances in them. But when you consume honey, it actually has the substances within it that regulate the secretion of insulin from your pancreas and inhibit insulin secretion. So you never get an excessive production of insulin. Whereas if you eat any other carbohydrate, including most starchy foods, you get an excessive production of insulin. When insulin is excessively produced over decades, insulin resistance develops, which is responsible for about 80% of the diseases that ail us in this country.
So does that mean fruit even has the same
No,
ratio?
does not mean that.
It's not a replacement of honey?
Honey has these substances. I don't know, honestly, about all fruits. You would expect that they would have some, but I just don't know that. I don't know. I know that if you ask your doctor as a diabetic, can I take honey? Can I eat fruit? Most will say, well, yes, if it's limited. Now, since honey comes from nectar, which is a vegetative source related to a lot of fruits, I would assume that some of the same elements are found in fruit. However, I just don't know that personally. I do know that these substances that regulate insulin production are found in honey, and that's the significant message. By the way, that the last point, those substances are responsible for over 75% of the amount of insulin that's produced in our body. Well, a tablespoon of honey, basically, what I'm saying is, will regulate insulin release about 75% of the time if you simply use honey rather than other sugars. Combination of two sugars, fructose and glucose, and I'm going to zip through this. I said 30 to 38. Sucrose, table sugar, has 50-50. High fructose corn syrup is either 45-55 or 48-52, depending on the type of high fructose corn syrup that you use. Glycogen, what I mentioned to you, is simply stored glucose in the liver or in the muscle cells that's been linked together by an enzyme to form glycogen molecules. And it's just one big globule of glucose. Glucose may be used by every cell. It's used by the brain. In fact, the brain exclusively burns glucose. So when I say this, people say, well, if the brain burns glucose, why don't we just consume glucose or sugar or high fructose corn syrup or other things that contain high starch levels, which are glucose? Why don't we just consume that? Well, the problem is, if we consume too much glucose, insulin levels shoot up very high, and within 90 minutes have driven all of that excessive sugar into the cells where it's stored as fat. No longer available for the brain. Once glucose goes into the cells, except the liver cells, it never comes out again. The liver is the only cell that shares its glucose with the rest of the body. The rest of the glucose that gets stored in cells around the muscles and in fat cells gets stored as fat.
So
Never comes out again.
what happens if you eat more than the liver can take?
Fantastic question. I have a slide that answers that, and I'm going to just zip through it right now. Because somebody always asks, what if you eat too much honey? What if you eat more fructose and glucose than the liver can possibly store? And all of this I'll summarize in a few slides, but if you find honey, it says in the book of Proverbs, if you find honey, eat just enough. Too much of it, and you'll throw up. Now, I've never tested that to see if it's true. If any of you want to, and you want to write to me
It's
or
true.
email me.
That's true.
George, have
I've
you
eaten a
tested
lot of
this?
honey in my life.
More than, in other words, a tablespoon has about 15 grams of liver glycogen capacity. So if you theoretically ate more than 5 or 6 tablespoons, you would saturate the liver right away. So 5 or 6 tablespoons are a quarter of a cup or a quarter plus a tablespoon. I have never tried to eat a quarter cup of honey at one time. I don't know if you'll get sick or not, but if you want to try it, let me know.
We get headaches. We get honey headaches.
Yeah.
That's what we call when we're eating too much or
Well, it's
extracting. So
probably
that
right.
makes sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it sounds like a stomachache to me.
As opposed to high fructose corn syrup, which is in every processed food that you can think of, including low-fat foods, and sucrose, which is table sugar. We can eat an unlimited amount of that without having symptoms. It's just amazing. Our bodies will tolerate that stuff, but it will not tolerate the sugars, same sugars that are found in honey.
But theoretically, if you can tolerate that much, I mean, you can if you eat a tablespoon or 2 tablespoons every hour,
Yeah.
then you will.
So-
What's going to happen physiologically?
Depends on what your activity level is. If your activity level is excessive, as in beekeeping or in extreme exercise or running, you'll burn up to 100 grams an hour. Well, you only have a limited amount of glucose in your blood, and you only have 75 grams in your liver. So you've got to have the sugar coming from someplace, the glucose coming from someplace. And that's the key, is to every time you eat, have a snack or a meal, produce liver glucose, liver glycogen. And that means you need to have fructose and glucose in identical ratios. Now, Gatorade, the exercise product that you may know of, until 2004 did not start adding fructose into their exercise drinks. But the science is finally catching up. They're realizing that you can't burn glucose if you're exercising. Because when you exercise, you produce cortisol, which inhibits insulin, which now no longer allows it to get driven into the cells. So the more glucose you consume when you're excessively exercising, the higher your blood sugar goes, and it never gets burned. That's the problem. Whereas if you eat equal amounts of fructose and glucose, it gets stored in your liver, which now can be released on a timed release basis to fuel your brain. Hypoglycemia, low blood sugar. Anybody experience that? That basically is you wake up in the morning nauseated, you feel like you're pregnant, only you're not, and you have morning sickness and you're shaky. Many people experience that. The doctors tell them they have hypoglycemia, which is nonsense, because there is no such thing as a disease of hypoglycemia. It's a symptom, which means your blood sugar is temporarily low. If it's temporarily low, your brain is saying you either eat something, or I'll start producing glucose for myself, or else we'll die together. And that's really what happens. The brain senses the sugar dropping low, triggers this metabolic condition called metabolic stress or adrenal-driven stress. Cortisol is released, adrenaline is released, we get the shakes, we feel nauseated, and the cortisol produces or makes the muscles start to break down into amino acids, which gets sent back to the brain to produce new glucose for the brain. It's that simple. So low blood sugar, hypoglycemia, high blood sugar, hyperglycemia, diabetes, it's all helped by consuming honey, because it stores sugar in the right place, which is in the glucose, and the glucose in the liver glycogen. Glucose produces the highest blood sugar and insulin level of any response of any sugar. Fructose doesn't raise blood sugar or blood glucose levels, because obviously we don't measure blood fructose, we measure blood glucose, so it doesn't have any effect on blood sugar whatsoever. But it does produce it doesn't produce a significant insulin rise. But when it's consumed with high fructose corn syrup, which has glucose in it, it produces a huge insulin spike. They have essentially the same effect on blood sugar and insulin as glucose alone. Honey does not raise blood sugar levels or insulin levels. In direct comparisons, I have multiple studies that have shown that honey produces more liver glycogen than any other food on a per gram basis. Glucose by itself produces no liver glycogen because it needs the fructose, remember, to bring it into the liver. Why is it important to have liver glycogen? Because that's what fuels the brain, the kidneys, and the red blood cells. Organs or tissues or cells which in themselves have no storage capacity for sugar. The only 3 parts of the body that are without a fuel reserve. They depend on the liver as their fuel reserve. And that's why You need honey before you go to bed, honey when you get up in the morning, honey before exercise, honey after exercise, because that's the only store we have for our brain, the red blood cells, and our kidneys. It's released on demand at times when our blood sugar levels are low. It's stored when our blood sugar levels is high. The liver will constantly make new glycogen. I'm going to zip through this. The ultimate result of low blood sugar levels, when the liver glycogen is depleted, as in food deprivation, prolonged exercise, or sleep, metabolic consequences, adrenal-driven stress, are the inevitable result. Immediate effect of low liver glycogen levels, as I told you, the brain sends a signal out to the adrenal glands to release cortisol and adrenaline so that they can start making new sugar to fuel the brain. Here's the slide I told you about. If you eat at 6 o'clock, your liver glycogen is full by 7, and it depletes at 10 grams an hour, and by 2 o'clock in the morning or 3 o'clock in the morning, the liver glycogen store is next to 0, and that's when your brain gets alerted that it needs more fuel, and it wakes you up by producing from the adrenal glands adrenaline and cortisol.
That level of depletion,
Yes.
the rate of depletion, is it assuming that you're inactive?
Yes, sleeping or resting, or trying to. Yes, that's exactly right. And here's the consequences of all of that. By running out of liver glycogen day after day, night after night, it starts as what we call metabolic stress. The next level is insulin resistance, which is fatigue, weight gain, increased fatty acids, triglycerides in your bloodstream. Third level is what we call the full-blown metabolic syndrome. The metabolic syndrome includes things like type 2 diabetes, obesity, elevated blood pressure, triglycerides, decreased HDL or decreased good cholesterol, and increased bad cholesterol. That progresses on to age and diabetes-related chronic inflammatory diseases, of which you can see Alzheimer's disease, Parkinsonism, and all the other arthritic conditions affecting the organs as we age. It is all entirely preventable. But where do we target our treatment as physicians? We target our treatment at these 3 levels right here. Prevention begins right here. If we simply would take honey before we go to bed, and when we wake up in the morning, about 80% of metabolic stress would be eliminated.
Where have you gleaned and accumulated this information and put it together like this? Where is this coming from? If the medical profession don't believe this at all, scientists don't believe it, where are you finding
The interesting thing is I stumbled onto it, was introduced to a pharmacist from Edinburgh, Scotland. And Mike McGuinness is his name. And Mike has for years, about 12, 15 years before that, determined that the practice of medicine was based on pharmaceuticals rather than on prevention. And so rather than do exhaustive medical research or research himself, he simply went back to basic physiology texts. And when he published his first book called The Hibernation Diet, I have a UK copy of a British copy of this. The editor dumbed it down, took out all the references, and I read through it and I said, Mike, you're just trying to sell a diet book. This is really gimmicky. People don't hibernate. He says, yes, but you need to understand what happens at night. And I said, send me your references. He sent me about 70 pages of information, some of which we incorporated into the US version of this book. We added about 30 pages. We dumbed down some of the UK versions, the UK terminologies, and tried to explain the physiology a little bit better. But when I met Mike about 2008 in January, I said, Mike, we need to write another book. And he said, I agree. So the two of us collaborated and wrote this book, in which we have now 230 some references in the back of this that include basic physiology texts and references that have been published in medical journals and scientific journals from around the world. Unfortunately, not many from the US. And that's the challenge.
Nobody has put all those references
I haven't
together.
seen it. I haven't seen it until what Mike did and what we have done in these books. And I commend Mike for his thinking about all of this. The focus on treatment in the US is on these things up here, because these are diseases for which we have a therapeutic pharmaceutical treatment. The focus on prevention is here, for which we can't get paid as physicians. The economic model falls apart when we start talking about prevention. And that's the challenge. Fortunately, I'm not in practice anymore, and I don't get paid by practicing, so I can do this. My platform is whoever will listen to me talk long enough to say, we have it all wrong in this country, because we could prevent 80% of this if we simply learned how to fuel our brains during sleep, in the morning, and during exercise. And the gold standard for fueling our brains is honey. There is no other food that can compare to it at all.
Does it matter raw or not raw?
Does it what?
Does it matter whether the honey is raw or not?
It does indeed. Filtered, let me just conclude with showing you one slide, and I'm going to zoom ahead here and go to, because I've it's not going down any further. Anyway, let me come back again. There's about 84 slides, but it's not letting me go to the end of the show. Let me do this way then. I'm sorry. You asked, does it matter if the honey is raw or unfiltered? Or unprocessed, basically. Andrew Schneider did a little research study on honey varietals and did some testing, and you'll recognize a lot of these labels. Subi honey and a lot of these other labels are sold in mainland stores all the time, and they're typically packaged in the honey bears like this. I mean, you cannot detect 1 grain of pollen in any of these honeys. And so Andrew probably inappropriately titled his articles, "Tests Show Most Store-Bought Honey Isn't Honey." That's probably not true. Most store-bought honey may be honey. At least that's the assumption. But you can't prove it because it contains no pollen. It's been microfiltered and heated. The character, the color has been changed. The enzymes in honey, though they are heat stable, the 4 major enzymes in honey are heat stable, will not be affected by heating up to 110 degrees, but prolonged heating above that may affect them. But you can't, none of the studies which we've referenced in this use processed honey. They all use raw honey of a particular varietal. Some of you have heard this, but Richard, I'll say it for you from a research point of view. Why don't people research this? Why aren't they concerned about this? Why aren't we doing clinical studies on using honey in treatment of diabetics? I presented this information in a session over a cup of coffee to a lead researcher in Colorado Springs. He represented a hospital that did clinical research in 9 different states and about 15 different medical facilities. And at first he listened very skeptically, and then he got excited. In about 40 minutes, he said, "I'm in." That's great. What do we do next? He said, "Let me talk to a couple of folks and we'll get you to do a presentation." He called me in about 2 weeks and he asked me one question. He said, "How many varietals of honey are there in the United States?" I said, "About 300. He said, "I was afraid you were going to say that." He said, "Nobody's interested in doing research on something for which we have no standard." And that's the problem. We know that raw, unprocessed honey will do the things that we've talked about. We know that filtering and microfiltering and heating honey will change the character of honey and remove most of its healthful substances. But yet we can't find the dollars to do basic research because there's no economic incentive in doing that. Joe Trainer has published a book called Honey the Gourmet Medicine, and in that book he said, honey is a medicine without profit. And that's the sad reality of where we are. That's why I get excited about talking to folks like you and beekeepers in general, because the message has got to start from the ground up, I believe. And sometimes I feel a little bit like what I heard Richard describe as I'm a voice crying in the wilderness, and I have no idea who's hearing me nor are they concerned. But this message could change the complexion of the way we practice medicine in this country if we simply applied it. Yes?
Aside from the enzymes and micronutrients that are damaged by heat, the previous health benefit that you were describing of the equal ratio of glucose to fructose sugar in the honey, is that affected by heat?
No, it is not.
Okay, so that particular health benefit would be...
But I don't know about those substances which I called hepatic insulin sensitizing substances. I just don't know. We've only discovered those in the last couple of years. Whether those are removed or changed or altered in character, I don't know, by processing. It may be that if they're included in pollen or particulate matter in the honey, that they're removed also. I just don't know that.
Plus, some of that honey could be adulterated too.
That's the other problem, which I don't like to mention. We mentioned it in our book, but as you know, we actually import 60% of our honey in the United States from overseas. So 40% is produced in country. 60% of it comes from someplace. When we put a 300 or 250% tariff on Chinese honey about 3-4 years ago, Chinese honey disappeared completely from the shelves overnight because there was about a 300% tariff on it. But then we started receiving honey from places like Singapore and Vietnam and Malaysia and India, countries which have no major honey production, and all of a sudden overnight they were producing metric tons of honey. Well, it was Chinese honey that the Chinese had just simply created bogus paperwork for and circumvented the tariffs and attempted to import the honey. They try to stay on top of this. My brother-in-law is the executive secretary of the American Honey Producers Association, and he meets all the time with lawyers and their suits going on multiple ones, but they will not, I don't think they can stay ahead of this. The message here was prompted by the question, is raw, unprocessed honey the best? And the answer obviously is yes. Because know your local beekeeper, know the source of your honey, know where you get it. Don't buy honey from somebody that blends or processes honey that may be imported honey, that may be microfiltered. We don't know. It may be honey, but I just don't know if it is or not. Let me just, how much is enough? 3 to 5 tablespoons a day, does all of this and more, without side effects, risks, or negative health consequences. What are the medicines to say that? There is no other medicine on the planet that can say it has 0 side effects. And I'll conclude. You can read the benediction for yourself, but there's a good verse in the book of Deuteronomy. It says, "May you feast on the crops of the field and be nourished with honey." I don't think it would be there if there wasn't a valid reason for emphasizing the use of honey. Richard, thank you very much for this privilege. Any questions any of you may have? Or?